scene from an early Hollywood silent. Hollywood has been recognized as the center of the film world for more than 8 decades, setting a standard that's been difficult to emulate. But what are Britain's silent film productions? Well, there certainly was an active industry. Many new production companies were formed, names that have since disappeared into oblivion. By 1910, London's Walthamstow area boasted at least 4 studio premises. But here, filmic history dates back much further, to the very year the moving picture was invented. On the 10th of June 1896, Walthamstow man E.G. Turner presented the very first local film show in the Victoria Hall, which stood on the site of today's Cannon Cinema, better known as the Granada. The material was all shot by Turner locally and shown to fascinated audiences on a Vitagraph projector. Turner invented many gadgets and systems, showing talkies as early as 1904 on a device called a cinematone. He gave shows at the High Street Baths and was the prime mover in the building of the Carlton Cinema in High Street. He was also a pioneer of the rental system of film distribution as part of the Walterdore Company in 1905. Walterdore also made equipment, including their own camera. One can't help but wonder why filmmakers should have chosen Walthamstow as a production centre. Well, although it's difficult to believe now, in those days the air was clean. Also, the building of the Great Eastern Railway in the 1890s made the borough easily accessible. The journey took just 20 minutes to Hoe Street from the Liverpool Street terminus. One other attraction was nearby Epping Forest, which proved to be a perfect location for a variety of subjects. Although the moving picture was invented in 1896, at first it was treated as a sideshow event. It took almost 2 decades for local commercial production to evolve. Sadly, most of those films have disappeared. However, the British Film Institute retains several copies of Walthamstow's productions. Also, some are held in a film archive in North London, owned by John Huntley.
Well, when you look at the old films on the shelves, sometimes it gives the impression that quite a lot of them have survived, but it isn't really true, I'm afraid. Take the case of Walthamstow Studios. I mean, we know that literally they made hundreds of films, and yet only the merest handful survive, and some of those just by chance. I mean, in the case of this particular film, Taming of the Shrew, when it came to me originally from a private collection, it was just on the old inflammable nitrate film, and it was already rapidly deteriorating. Now, this means that this film was not only dangerous in terms of catching fire, but it also had built into it the seeds of its own destruction. This was the material that was used, by the way, for printing films right up to 1953, and so there was a frantic rush to try and copy it. I reckon that in about another 6 months it could well be that this too would have become another one of the lost films. Now, happily, it's on modern films, cellulose acetate. It isn't all that different chemically, but it makes all the difference in terms of its chance of survival. And it may last now perhaps for, who knows, as long as good quality paper, perhaps about 1,000 years.
Near Whipps Cross, at the junction of Wood Street, the remains of a silent studio still survive. It's now a sheet metal works, but it was once the home of Precision Films. Built in 1910, it was actually the very first studio in the area to be custom built, incorporating glass-covered stages on the ground floor with workshops underneath. The glass roof still remains, plus the original scene dock doors that allowed access for the many specialist sets of the period. Also at Whipps Cross were the Fitz Studios, set up in 1912, previously associated via the Hepworth Company with the specialist techniques of filming children and animals. Alongside the old Midland Railway Bridge at 588 Leabridge Road, Leighton, stands a building that was once the studios of Tiger Films, now occupied by a car exhaust company. The original building was a horse tram shed, which was converted into a studio just before the First World War. The proprietor, I.B. Davidson, was a well-known film pioneer who employed a staff of just 6. Yet, apart from all their other duties, they still managed to cope with their own film processing. But the 2 main studios in the area before 1924 were British and Colonial and Broad West. The Broad West Film Company was established in 1914 by G.T. Broadbridge and Walter West. 2 years later, they purchased their new premises from Cunard Films. This chimney is the only remaining sign of the studio site that once stood here at 245 Wood Street, Walthamstow. The building is now occupied by a clothing manufacturer. On the ground floor were the offices, props, wardrobe, workshops and processing equipment, with the studio on the top floor measuring an impressive 115 by 45 feet. The glass roof made full use of natural light, aiding the various cameramen, who often brought in their own equipment, using cameras mainly of the wooden boxed type, manufactured by Moy, Debris and Pathé. It's also interesting to note that film rushes were shown on a projector crudely set up in the property store. In an attempt to compete with action films from the USA, Broad West featured the intrigue and class system of the horse racing world in their many films written by the novelist Nat Gould. The British and Colonial Kinematograph Company was established in 1909. From 1913, it was based on the site of an old roller skating rink in Hoe Street, which, since 1956, has been the local telephone exchange. Processing was handled by its head office in West End's Endell Street. Frank Ashen was employed by the company when he was just a teenager way back in 1919. One of his more glamorous jobs was to sign in famous actors and actresses of the period.
When the offices were situated in the Red House, the procedure seemed to be that when the production was in progress, that I used to go down with a small book, take it down to the reception, which was originally the small office where I first worked. I used to go down with this book to the reception, and the people used to sign in as they came through reception and out through another door into the main studio onto their dressing rooms.
It was quite common to use artists currently appearing on the West End stage, who used the convenient rail link to Hoe Street Station. After filming, they could return in plenty of time for the evening performance. Local people were used as extras, often recruited from the bar of the Duke's Head in Wood Street. Stan Reiter was born and has lived in Walthamstow all his life. He remembers the period well.
Yeah, well, as far as I can remember, there were five studios in Walthamstow. The British and Colonial in the Hoe Street, and 2 at Whipps Cross, and like another one in Wood Street. Like I remember them seeing them once filming a scene in Wood Street where a chap had to come out of a bank and look up the street because they picked the wrong moment for that, because there's all us kids coming out of school, there's a big mob of us all around the cameraman hanging on to his camera trying to keep it still. They're very interesting days, you know. Well, they use the old clock house in Wood Street. There was a chap on a horse just dressed as an Erlen soldier, and as he galloped into the yard and out of our view, and there's all the local lads dressed as German soldiers chasing about all around Whipps Cross there in the forest. Because when it was shown at the Old Crown, everybody said, "Good old Nobby," you know, and they recognise them on the screen, you know. There's a real laugh. As I say, the film actually was not so good. I used to hang about there for ages, you know. I mean, we come home to dinner one day, and there's a lot of people, when they come back, that had no dinner because their mothers weren't there. was up the studio. They was acting as like as Belgian peasants and things like that. There's one of the films they made there was The Burgomaster of Stillman, with Sir John Martin Harvey, and it was a First World War film, and they used the yard in Worcester, which is now the Co-op Milk Yard. Like in those days, it was twice as big and all cobbled, and it looked just like a square in Belgium. I saw the film when they showed it at the old Crown Cinema in Wood Street, but it wasn't too good. And as a matter of fact, there were sort of 10 cinemas in Walthamstow then.
Many of those 10 cinemas showed the series of Shakespearean dramas produced by British and Colonial, such as the 1923 production of Taming of the Shrew. Taming of the Shrew was typical of many films of the period, producers often taking the easy way out by transferring stage classics directly onto film. Troupes of actors were provided by Stoll Theatres, who held a major interest in the industry. In fact, the whole theatre world exercised strict control over film production, eventually proving to be fatal. Shooting in the middle of winter was literally an ice-cold experience. Here, the actor's breath betrays the low temperature of the glass-clad studio. Larger-than-life actor Lorna Dell D. Maitland makes an enthusiastic entrance. Unfortunately, the public were less enthusiastic about Shakespearean drama. They were inflicted with stagey, black-and-white films, which lacked the most essential element of sound. So it's not surprising that this, along with other similar Shakespearean epics, received little public acclaim. Frank Ashen recalls a film that afforded him his one taste of stardom.
They were doing this film, it was, I think, called A Gamble in Lives. It starred Norman MacKinnell, Malvin the Longfellow, and Alec Fraser, and me. There was an office, I think it was dealing with a shipping firm, and there was an office which they were filming, and several of the staff were drawn into this thing, sitting about at desks and things, but I played my somewhat normal part there as being a junior dog's body. I was sitting at the desk there, and in this particular action, this chap came in and wanted to see the boss man. I had to go to the reception to find out what he wanted, and I turned and went to an office at the back, opened the door, and announced the arrival of this man and beckoned him in. Well, that roughly was the shooting of this particular day. Well, a day or so afterwards, I happened to be on some jaunt up to the head office at Endell Street, and I went up by bus, and by the time I arrived at the office there seemed to be a bit of a flap on, and they were saying, can you get back there? So I did an about turn and went back to the studio, and there was a bit of a kerfuffle there as well, and this fellow Ridgway, who was the producer of this film, he came up and said, have you got the same clothes on as you had the other day? Well, he didn't know I'd only got about one suit, so it didn't make very much difference.
Apart from being film producers, British and Colonial also formed a company to build aircraft, including the B&C Boxkite, later to become the famous Bristol Boxkite. This afforded them the unique opportunity of including thrilling aerial scenes in their scenarios. In the 1914 production, Through the Clouds, a particularly dangerous but well-paid stunt was performed by Cyril Taylor Smith, who recalled receiving the princely sum of 30 golden sovereigns for his efforts. News of the studios appeared in the press as recently as 1988, featuring the very first Miss World back in 1912. 94-year-old Alice Hyde recalled memories of one of the winning prizes, a screen test at a Walthamstow studio. Just as today, the public demanded plenty of action. As a result, around 1912, a character was created that did satisfy the public's hunger for action. Actor Percy Moran played the role of Lieutenant Daring, Master Spy.
One of the most interesting, I think, of all the British and colonial films is the one that features Lieutenant Daring. Now this, in a sense, was the beginning of the whole idea of a series of programs. The first time it was ever done. It's common now, television, the Avengers, the Bill, and so on. In those days, the idea of having one character who appeared in episodes lasting about half an hour each, and the same man bobbing up each time, was totally new, and it created a whole new form of filmmaking. They weren't serials, they weren't like Pearl White, just sort of ending on a cliffhanger. The man appeared in a story which went right through to the end, and in this particular case, of the one that survives, Lieutenant Daring, and the story of the stolen plans of the minefields of the North Sea. Now this particular film is considered a bit daring in its day because it's about two Italian spies. He's an artist and he has with him his girlfriend, and what he does is he copies the plans of the minefield onto her back in chalk, and then she puts her dress over the top of it and they make their getaway, pursued of course by Lieutenant Daring. Final fascination of this particular film is the transport in it, because what happens is Lieutenant Daring chases the boat train down to Folkestone using all known forms of transport in 1912. A horse and a bicycle and a motorcycle and an old derrick motor car, and right at the very end, something extremely modern when this film was made, an aeroplane. It's an old, believe it or not, it was called a British and colonial aeroplane, a Boxkite. It later became the Bristol Boxkite and virtually founded the British civil aviation.
Faithful companion Nero releases Daring from yet another dangerous situation, followed of course by the inevitable chase scene. Daring was cast as a naval lieutenant, since at that time masculinity was often linked with the Navy. A new episode was shown to the public every month. Due to popular demand, this was later increased to one every 2 weeks. Great pains were taken to be authentic, such as in this scene of a train on the outskirts of Folkestone Harbour, recreating the actual setting as scripted. If imitation is the best form of flattery, then the Lieutenant Daring series must have been highly regarded, since the idea was copied by a silent studio company based at Limes Road, Croydon. The Clarendon Company created a character whose name, unlike Daring, didn't immediately conjure up an image of masculinity. Many appeared in front of Walthamstow's cameras, such as Ronald Colman, Clive Brooke, and Charles Hawtrey. Artists also hosted local events. In this newsreel of 1912, popular star Ivy Close was invited as honoured guest at the kick-off of a charity football match between Nome Athletic and Earlsfield. Ivy appeared in many of the Broadwest productions. This rare piece of archive footage enables us to glimpse into local history far more effectively than any written record ever could. During the First World War, the British government began to realise the power and influence of the moving picture. Early difficulties were encountered by wartime newsreel cameramen attempting to fight their way through military red tape. As a result, in 1915, B&C joined other companies to form the Cinematograph Trade Committee, which later became the Ministry of Information, and subsequently today's Central Office of Information. The managing director of British and Colonial, J. McDowell, along with Jeff Malins, spent much of the war filming on the Western Front, and in 1916 made The Battle of the Somme, which proved to be a highly successful production. Battle of the Somme received 2,000 cinema bookings and grossed a staggering sum of money for the period of over £30,000. The trade press sung its praises in no uncertain terms. No written description, no matter how facile his pen, no verbal description by the most interested participator could hope to convey the reality of modern warfare with the force and conviction shown in this marvellous series of pictures. His Majesty King George V declared that the public should see these pictures. And Prime Minister David Lloyd George was even more expressive. Be up and doing. See that this picture, which is in itself an epic of self-sacrifice and gallantry, reaches everyone. Herald the deeds of our brave men to the end of the earth. This is your duty. A much earlier battle was the subject of one of the most spectacular productions to emerge from the studios. This was the very ambitious The Battle of Waterloo, Britain's first serious attempt to compete against the Italian film industry, who produced Quo Vadis, plus work from the USA, directed by the legendary D.W. Griffith, such as his highly acclaimed Birth of a Nation. Directed by Charles Weston, Waterloo was truly a spectacle. With a running time of around 75 minutes, it proudly boasted 116 scenes, involving 2,000 soldiers, 1,000 horses, plus 50 cannons. Many of the scenes were filmed in Epping Forest. The film proved to be a big money spinner, being sold to rental companies for £5,000. British and Colonial received wide acclaim for their epic. Sadly today, we are deprived of fully appreciating its effectiveness, since most of the film has either decomposed or has been lost, Only this short sequence has survived the test of time. So ends the tale of an extinct local industry. Revisiting the sites of the old studios, one cannot help but wonder that if Walthamstow's film industry were still alive today, whether great works of art would have emerged from those sparse and often crude studio surroundings. Alas, Hollywood E17 was not to survive. In 1924, both B&C and Broadwest went into liquidation, although the Wood Street studios did continue under new management until 1931, thus bringing to an end a fascinating but short-lived era. Those early pioneers did, however, leave their mark. Certainly they influenced one filmmaker whose name is regarded as a legend in film history. Alfred Hitchcock was born in nearby Leytonstone High Road, and, like his predecessors in Walthamstow, he chalked up many firsts, including Britain's first sound film, Blackmail. At the edge of Epping Forest, where so many scenes of early productions were filmed, stands this hotel, named in memory of the great man. Unfortunately, there is no such epitaph to commemorate those other filmmakers who, as part of an active local industry, contributed so much all those decades ago. All that remains are a handful of films and some faded memories.